Okay, Art, we're ready. Go ahead and introduce yourself if you would.
Good evening. Thanks for coming, and thanks to Michelle for organizing the event. I'm Art George, resident of Solvang, California. My background was originally as a lawyer and a historian. Actually, I wrote a history book about Russia. But for about 20 years now, I've been focusing a lot of my research and writing on mythology. And so I've got now 3 mythology books out. One was about the Garden of Eden story in the Bible from the mythological perspective. And then I published another one earlier this year called The Mythology of America's Seasonal Holidays. And then just a month ago, I published one called The Mythology of Wine, because there's a lot of wine mythology in the ancient world. And since I'm a winemaker myself, that was an interesting project to combine the two. Today's talk, though, is based on the Mythology of Holidays book, and it covers some highlights from the Christmas chapter of that book. So I'll talk for about 40 minutes, and then we can have questions and answers, discussion, and so forth. Wait a minute. The slide is not advancing.
Right.
Click on the slides.
Yeah, put your cursor over the slide.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, there we go.
These little tricks.
Yeah, fancy trick. All right, here's what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to go through the nativity stories in the Bible and the meanings of particular parts of it and how they get interpreted. Then I'm going to talk about why we celebrate Christmas at all. And on December 25th, I'll get into Santa Claus, mythological aspects, the evolution of Christmas in late Rome and Europe. And then I'll spend a few minutes at the end talking about one possible contemporary spiritual meaning of Christmas. Our Christmas story comes entirely from the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. Mark and John do not have it. And the nativity accounts of Matthew and Luke are quite different. In fact, they don't have a single scene in common. So it's helpful to compare and contrast the 2 stories here at the outset before we get any further. In Matthew, there's no trip. The family is just living in its house in Bethlehem, which is where the family lives. And Mary gets impregnated by the Holy Spirit. An angel counsels Joseph not to worry, so he decides not to divorce her, and he will adopt Jesus. The birth is in the family house. It's not in a manger. And that Matthew is where we get the story about the star and the adoration of the Magi. But this is not the night of the birth. It happens sometime after, because it takes them a while to travel there once they get the news. And then Matthew is where you have the story of the massacre of the innocents and the flight to Egypt. And then they return from Egypt after Herod dies, but they go straight to Nazareth. And in Luke's, you get the Annunciation by the angel Gabriel to Mary that she will become pregnant through the Holy Spirit and the power of God, which is the incarnation. And then you get this long account of John the Baptist's conception as well. Mary's pregnancy, singing of the Magnificat. And in Luke, the family is from Nazareth, not to Bethlehem, but they travel to Bethlehem to pay taxes. And then that's when Jesus is born. And he's born in an outbuilding that has a manger in it. And in Luke, there are no magi. Instead, you have these shepherds that were with their flock at night, and then they hear a chorus of angels praising the divine child. And then the shepherds come to adore the child. And then after that, 40 days later, the parents bring Jesus to the Jerusalem temple to be presented in the temple. And then you also get the story later on about Jesus in the temple at age 12. And so it goes all the way to age 12. And as you'll see, this extension follows a common mythological pattern. So I will cover that too briefly, even though it doesn't strictly have to do with Christmas. We have to be careful about what we mean by myth. So I think we should define it so we know how we're approaching the story here. My short definition of a myth is that it's a narrated story, usually, but not always, involving some divine beings or heroes and supernatural events. And it conveys sacred truths to the community. And the events narrated may or may not have actually happened as a matter of history, but for our purposes, this doesn't matter. What matters is that the sacred truth that is being conveyed. Thus, another definition of myth is that it's a lie that tells the truth. Under this understanding, the Christmas story is a myth. There's all kinds of mythological elements: a royal genealogy, miraculous conception, angels prophesizing, singing and rising to heaven, prophetic dreams, a moving star, adorations of the wonder child, and an evil king trying to kill him. Therefore, in this talk, I'm mostly not concerned with whether the events in the nativity accounts literally happened as reported. Rather, I focus on how the stories were told in the manner of myth, as defined above. This approach enables us to understand the fuller meaning of the stories. Having said this, though, I would be remiss if I didn't share with you briefly what the professional New Testament scholars think about the historicity of the nativity accounts. It's fair to say that the vast majority of New Testament scholars outside the fundamentalist or evangelical orbit agree that Jesus' birth did not happen as reported in Matthew and Luke. Rather, he was born without fanfare in Nazareth in his parents' home, and he grew up there in obscurity. This in no way detracts from the events and meaning of the rest of the Gospels, as we can see from the mere fact that Mark and John don't consider it necessary to discuss Jesus' birth. Even the subsequent chapters in Matthew and Luke don't mention Jesus' birth again. Scholars think that the infancy stories were probably the last parts of these Gospels to be written and included. Now, to take the first example on the slide regarding historicity, an empire-wide census of the type described in Luke would have left a historical record, but there is none. Also, Luke said it occurred while Quirinius was governor of Syria, but he became governor only in the year 6 CE. But Matthew says Jesus was born when Herod was king of Judea, but he died in 4 BCE, 10 years earlier. So there's a chronological inconsistency between the Gospels of at least 10 years. Now, early Christians saw the historical problem here and realized that Luke never intended to give a literally historical account, but instead wanted to convey a symbolic message. Saint Ambrose, for example, in the 4th century gave the following interpretation in a sermon, quote, "When the secular census is referred to, the spiritual is implied. A census to be made known not to the king of the earth, but to the king of heaven. It is a profession of faith, an enrollment of souls, that you may know that this is of Christ, not of Augustus. The whole world is ordered to be enrolled," unquote. In other words, Ambrose was looking at the story as a myth in the sense I defined earlier, because it conveyed a sacred truth. Now, the other examples on the slide there I will get to in a moment, but before going further on any of the theoretical stuff, it's interesting to look at the modern representations of the story, because here, which is fairly typical, you see both the Magi and the shepherds in the picture. And so what we have is a conflation of the two stories. And here we go again, another conflation, because we don't have shepherds here, but they're represented by the sheep, and also the angels in the Luke story are present, okay? So 2 out of 3 ain't bad. What's interesting is Joseph is holding a shepherd's crook, okay? And so is one of the Magi, which is really interesting. And also, animals, which are not in the gospel accounts, often appear in nativity scenes. Lambs, donkeys, and oxen are especially common. Now, here they are, as you can see. Lambs appear because they're sacrificial animals offered at the temple altar. They represent Christ's sacrifice, so their presence at the nativity foreshadows the child's fate. Christ is termed the Lamb of God. When there are many sheep, as in this case, they represent the flock of Christ's followers. An ass and an ox, humble animals who serve people, are often present to symbolize Jesus's humble beginnings, as well as the attitude of humbleness that he championed. They allude to the prophecy in Isaiah 1 verse 3, which reads, quote, "An ox knows its owner and the ass its master's manger, but Israel does not know, my people do not understand," unquote. Since even these lowly animals at the nativity know that Jesus is the Lord, the implied question is, will people recognize this too? In Christian thinking, also related was the prophecy of the book of Habakkuk 3 verse 2 that, quote, "Between two animals you shall become known," unquote, which was interpreted to mean the ox and the ass of Isaiah at the Epiphany. Thus, the Magi's and the animals recognizing Jesus' divinity, his epiphany, was held to be predicted by Hebrew Bible scripture. This scripture may explain, since Isaiah mentioned the manger, may explain why Luke used an outbuilding where animals are kept and a manger in the story. And here the camel is just one that one of the Magi traveled on. Human imagination took further liberties with the story, as shown here in Leonardo's Adoration of the Magi, where many trappings of the gospel accounts are absent. From the perspective of Jesus' followers, in their time, there was no true peace on earth. The world was all wrong and in disarray. This idea was later reflected in European paintings of the Nativity, showing the surroundings in disrepair or ruin, especially ruined classical architectural structures with vegetation growing out of the cracks. They symbolize the chaos of the world into which Jesus was born, and also the end of classical culture and religion and the beginning of a new era of Christianity. This artistic motif was inspired by a medieval myth. According to the story, the Romans built a, quote, temple of peace, and they asked the god Apollo how long it will endure. The god answered that it will last until a maiden bears a child. Thinking that such an event was impossible, the Romans thought it would stand forever. But on the night Mary bore Jesus, the temple collapsed to the ground. Indeed, Christianity's ultimate earthly goal as a countercultural movement was nothing less than to dismantle the classical Greco-Roman political, social, and religious order. We see this motif again in the upper left of Fra Angelico's and Filippo Lippi's Adoration of the Magi. Here, we also see the addition of peacocks. Why peacocks? Because they symbolize immortality. They're linked to the phoenix, which comes back to life from the ashes, as well as to the sun, which begins coming back to life on the winter solstice. And in ancient Rome, the solstice was thought to occur on December 25th. So why do we have infancy narratives at all? One reason is theological, specifically Christological. What we see in the Gospels is Jesus' divinity being pushed back earlier and earlier. In Mark and John, as I mentioned, they didn't think the story was necessary. In Mark, the earliest Gospel, the first sign that Jesus was divine was at his baptism as an adult, when God declared, "You are my beloved Son." This is called the adoptive theory of Christ's divinity. He would have become divine at that point, not at his birth. But Matthew and Luke wanted to show that Jesus was divine from his very conception through divine means. So the miraculous circumstances of his conception are narrated. John goes further. Jesus existed, according to John, since before the creation of the world. So a separate birth narrative would have confused things. The word became flesh, he said, and John doesn't need to explain how. In John, the Christmas story is logically precluded because Jesus was not born of a woman. If our culture had followed John rather than Matthew and Luke, we would have no Christmas, at least as we know it. There are other reasons for the infancy stories too. One was to show that Jesus was superior to John the Baptist. This was necessary because there are many followers of John who thought that he, not Jesus, was the Messiah. So Jesus and John movements were competing with each other at the time. Another reason is to prove that Jesus was the Messiah by constructing a story that fulfilled Old Testament prophecies about the Messiah. This would hopefully convince skeptical Jews that Jesus was the Messiah. As for the Gentiles, they were skeptical of the new religion. And it shows that Jesus and Christianity are rooted in ancient and venerable tradition, which was valued by the Gentiles. And finally, there was simple curiosity of people about the birth and early life of Jesus, and this created a demand for such stories. There are also some mythological reasons for having infancy narratives. First, narratives emphasize the spiritual as opposed to the physical nature of the birth. It's a spiritual event, an opportunity for myth. We see this in myths a lot. For example, Buddha was said to have been born not in the normal way, but through his mother's side at the level of the heart chakra, thus symbolizing that his was a spiritual birth. Similarly, in the Greco-Roman world, beginning with Plato, philosophers and other educated people thought that gods had nothing to do with earthly matter and therefore did not have sex. So forget all the old stories about Zeus. Okay, that was prior. So according to Plutarch, for example, when Plato was conceived in his mother, Perictone, it was by means of Apollo's divine breath or spirit, pneuma, and power, dunamis. And these are combined intermediary divine forces that avoided the god making sexual or even direct fleshly contact with the mortal mother. Luke 1 verse 3:5 likewise uses the same combination. At the Annunciation, the angel Gabriel tells Mary, quote, "The Holy Spirit, pneuma, hagion, will come upon you, and the power of dunamis of the Most High will overshadow you," unquote. The second mythological aspect is that this story fits into the birth of the hero mythological motif, which is very famous. And this is about how lives have been famous individuals who do extraordinary things. You project back to the time of their births, and then that results in myths to show how great they are. And the elements of these myths fall into certain patterns. And here there are more of them, but these are the ones that I want to emphasize. First, there's a royal genealogy, which establishes the claim to kingship and stature for the young child. Both Matthew and Luke contain genealogies, although they are inconsistent in several respects. The Messiah in the Dead Sea Scrolls is also from the line of David. Other figures with genealogies for this purpose include Plato, Aeneas, Perseus, Theseus, Asclepius, Heracles, Jason, and Romulus. A second element is a miraculous conception by divine intervention, which makes the hero the son or son of a goddess. Other examples include Romulus by the god Mars, Aeneas by Aphrodite, Heracles, Alexander the Great, and Perseus, all by Zeus, Augustus Caesar, Plato, Pythagoras, and Asclepius, all by Apollo. And a third element is that the human mother is a virgin before conception. So in the case of humans, Danae, the mother of Persea, Rhea Silva, mother of Romulus and Remus, Coronis, Asclepius, Ethra of Theseus, Alcmene, mother of Heracles. Gods happen too. We have Semele, Semele's mortal, mother of Dionysus, Leto, Apollo, but all were conceived through intercourse in all these cases. Mary and Jesus is the only clear instance where there was no intercourse with the Virgin. So the conception of Jesus in this respect outdoes them all. Actually, the mother of Plato in some of the stories was a virgin. That's one possible exception. A fourth characteristic is omens and prophecies precede the birth. So here in our example, we have the star and the Annunciation, the chorus of angels, Joseph's dreams, and citations to Old Testament prophecies. Other examples include Augustus Caesar, Apollonius of Tyana, Pythagoras, Plato, Alexander the Great by Magi, Aeneas, Cyrus, and Zoroaster. Another aspect is that after birth, the enemies of the hero try to kidnap and kill him, and he escapes. What Joseph Campbell calls the motif of infant exile and return. This is what happens in the massacre of the innocents and the flight to Egypt. Other examples include Heracles, Moses, Sargon, Jason, Paris, Romulus, Asclepius, Augustus Caesar, Zoroaster, and Krishna. Another element is that he's born into and raised in modest conditions by foster parents or even animals. And in Jesus' case, they were poor and his early childhood is obscure. Joseph is Jesus's adoptive father, and nothing is known of his childhood in Nazareth. Other examples of this motif include Perseus, Paris, Jason, Romulus, Cyrus, Moses. A female example is Semiramis. Then in later childhood, the hero displays extraordinary abilities, as Jesus shows in Luke at the temple at age 12. We'll get to that in a minute. Other examples include Pythagoras, Epicurus, Alexander the Great, Apollonius of Tyana, Augustus Caesar, the Olympic champion Theagenes, and Cyrus. And finally, he is, as a result of the circumstances of his birth, he's divine or semi-divine. And examples here are Heracles, Pythagoras, Plato, Asclepius, Epicurus, Augustus Caesar, and Apollonius of Tyana. So that's how another aspect of how the story conforms to mythological motifs and principles. Okay, I want to cover a few particular aspects in Matthew's account, and then I'm going to do the same with Luke. As you can see, it's the conception, the star, massacre of the innocents, the Magi, and the flight to Egypt. As I mentioned, virginal conception pushes back Jesus' divinity to his conception. Matthew thinks this fulfills scripture, although the scripture itself doesn't really support that, the one that he's mentioning. The virginal conception emphasizes the spiritual rather than physical conception of the birth, and that's the mythological meaning that I already discussed. It shows the superiority of Jesus to John the Baptist, who was born in the normal fashion, not in any miraculous fashion. And as I mentioned, there were competitors amongst their followers. The virginal conception also addresses claims that really existed at the time that Jesus was born out of wedlock. So this papers that over. And it may reflect the influence of the Qumran community, which claimed that God would father the Messiah. As for the star, it has mythological aspects and rhetorical or polemical aspects. Such omens fit the birth of the hero motif, as I just mentioned, and they often signal the coming birth of a new king, regime change, as in Rome. It also symbolizes the coming of spiritual light to humankind, and the unnatural movements of the star mean the presence, symbolize the presence of divine forces. As for the polemical aspects for the story, the star makes Jesus compare favorably with famous Romans of whom similar claims were made concerning their births. For example, in Virgil's Aeneid, the god Jupiter sent a star to guide Aeneas and his father in escaping from Troy, enabling Aeneas to reach Italy and also when Julius Caesar died, a comet appeared, marking his deification and ascension into heaven, which made his successor Augustus the son of a god. So Augustus issued coinage portraying the comet with the legend Divine Julius. When Nero died, a comet also appeared, marking the coming of a new emperor. Christians claiming that Jesus was divine were in competition with this and felt a need to respond in kind. Also, on the polemical side, the star story helps combat astrology, which Christianity opposed. Here, the heavens are subject to God and Jesus. And it also fulfills an Old Testament prophecy, that of Balaam, who was a magus, actually. And the scripture says, a star will come forth from Jacob and a scepter will rise from Israel, referring to the Messiah. As for the Magi, this has a theological and a mythological purpose. It depicts Gentiles recognizing Jesus as the divine savior, superior to other religions. The story may have been inspired by a recent historical event. In 66 CE, the Armenian king and Zoroastrian priest and magus, Tiridates I, traveled with other magi to Rome to pay homage to the new emperor Nero, to vow fidelity to him and be coronated by him. Matthew again may be setting up a parallel contrast between the Roman emperors and Jesus as king. One hint that this is so is that history records that Tiridates took a different route home, as the Magi did in Matthew. Matthew also said that the episode fulfilled various Old Testament prophecies, which I've listed on the slide. I won't go through all those with you. You probably already read them. The massacre of the innocents, scholars agree that this event is not historical. Such a large and infamous event would have left a historical record, as did other infamous actions by Herod and any actions by Augustus. So what was Matthew's purpose? Matthew liked to portray Jesus as another Moses. Here he's likening Herod to the Egyptian Pharaoh and Jesus to Moses. The Pharaoh tried to kill the baby Moses, but he escaped in a basket. Jesus similarly escapes Herod. The story also parallels the chosen people's sojourn in Egypt. In Genesis, Joseph was sold into slavery there, and later Moses led the people out. Matthew has the Holy Family retrace the route. As I mentioned, this episode also fits the birth of the hero motif. That's kind of technical. I'll skip that one and get to Luke. In Luke's account, we have a humble birth in an outbuilding with a manger. The shepherds and the angelic choir are there. And at the ending of the narrative, we find the presentation of Jesus in a temple and Jesus in the temple at age 12. His infancy account does not end until the birth of the hero motif is complete. So I cover that to the end. The Messiah's birth in an outbuilding for animals conveys Jesus' humble beginnings and his own message of humility. This too fits the birth of the hero motif. But as early as the late 2nd century, Christian writers portrayed Jesus' birth as having taken place in a cave as well, in the wilderness. This too emphasizes the humility theme even more acutely. Salvation can come from anywhere. Caves also symbolize a spiritual, supernatural realm, including the primordial state just before the creation. In Greek myths, wise men, heroes, philosophers went to caves for initiation and transformation to gain illumination. So Jesus' birth in a cave marks the creation of a new era and the enlightenment that Jesus will bring. And here's an example of a portrayal of the nativity in a cave. Shepherds represent gathering converts, especially Gentiles, into the flock of Christians who will be saved. The Messiah will lead the Lord's flock. As St. Ambrose preached in a nativity sermon, quote, "Christ is born and the shepherds begin their watch. Those who will gather the flocks of the Gentiles, previously living as untended beasts, into the fold of the Lord." Shepherds are humble people of modest means, so they symbolize Jesus' modest social position and his message of humility. But shepherds are also known as tricky, and they had dubious reputations. Their adoration of Jesus symbolizes Jesus' Jesus' redemption of sinners and their inclusion into his community. Shepherds also link Jesus to David, to kingship, and to Bethlehem. Luke has Joseph and Mary go to Bethlehem because Joseph was descended from David. David was a shepherd in Bethlehem. In fact, it was only as a shepherd that the Bible connects David to Bethlehem. And this happens in the scene where he's anointed as king, at which moment the Spirit of God comes upon him. Thus, the presence and adoration of the shepherds connects Jesus to his ancestor David and supports the notions of Jesus being born in Bethlehem and of his kingly status. In the presentation story, Jesus, as the firstborn, is taken to the Jerusalem temple 40 days after his birth, where the temple prophets Simeon and Anna proclaim him as Savior and as a light of revelation to the Gentiles. There are errors in Luke's description of the ritual, but he wrote it as he did in order to conform the event to his purposes. This is an example of the definition of myth as a lie that tells the truth. Luke's purposes are as follows. It betters John the Baptist, who is recognized only by his relatives and neighbors, where it is proclaimed that John will pave the way for the Messiah. Jesus is recognized in the temple itself, which is as good as it gets. Indeed, the purpose here is for Jesus to be recognized as the Son of God and Messiah in the temple itself. This bookends the climax of Jesus' ministry at the temple and at the end of the gospel. The story is modeled on the story of Samuel, whose parents offered him to the service of the Lord at the temple in Shiloh, which at the time was the main temple in Israel. And this segues into the story of Jesus at age 12 at the temple. When he was 12, the family makes a pilgrimage to Jerusalem for Passover. When Mary and Joseph leave for home, Jesus stays behind. The next day, Mary and Joseph notice that Jesus is not with them. They return to Jerusalem to fetch him. They find him at the temple, conversing with teachers of the law, who are amazed by his learning and wisdom. When Mary scolds Jesus for staying behind, he replies, quote, "Did you not know that I must be in my Father's house?" Unquote. By asserting that God is his true Father, Jesus is recognizing that he is indeed the Son of God and that his sacred calling is more important than his earthly family identity or obligations. This episode also fits into the mythological hero's journey or hero cycle made popular by Joseph Campbell. Early in the hero's journey, there is always a moment where he hears the call to adventure. This is when the hero understands his purpose and his identity, what he must do and who he must become. In Luke, this is that moment for Jesus, although he is still too young to act upon it. He will act upon it later once he's baptized. The point for the moment is that Jesus' mind has already reached maturity. This reflects the stories of other heroes such as Cyrus, Alexander the Great, and Augustus, who likewise in myths demonstrate their precocity at the same age of 12. Okay, now we can move on to the Christmas holiday itself. One question is why even celebrate the birth of Jesus? We could have celebrated his miraculous conception, the recognition of him by the Magi, his baptism, his resurrection. Well, the resurrection was Easter, but what about the rest? Well, baptism never took hold. Recognition by the Magi did become Epiphany. But the birth of Jesus' birth was not initially celebrated. Similarly, the deaths rather than the births of saints and martyrs were celebrated. The reason is that birth was too much of the flesh. It wasn't spiritual enough. But Jesus' conception and birth did become more important. One reason was the trend toward higher Christology that I mentioned earlier. Jesus' conception and birth stories were ways to make him more divine at his creation, and therefore we should be celebrating his birth. Also, Christianity was developing in the Gentile Greco-Roman world, where gods and emperors often had miraculous births too. The stories of Jesus' miraculous conception and birth enabled Christians to compete with this religion. So they needed it in order to be able to compete with the pagans. And so these factors led to the festival of the Nativity, as Christmas was originally called. Then we get to the question of why is it on December 25th? Well, the theological reason was that the creation was thought to have been in the spring on the equinox, which is March 25th. And likewise, the creation of Jesus was thought to have occurred then too, which would have been his conception. So he's born 9 months later, of course, which is on December 25th, which, as I've mentioned, is the winter solstice in Rome. Another reason was from pagan influence. In Rome, December 25th was the birthday of the sun, since it was the solstice. And the sun was deified as Sol Invictus, the invincible sun. And in 274 CE, the Emperor Aurelian proclaimed Sol Invictus the exclusive divine protector of Rome. So then when Constantine came along, Christ became identified with the sun too, because Constantine became a Christian, right? So Jesus' birthday was substituted for Sol's, and Christians in doing so relied on New Testament passages identifying Christ with the sun and with light, and so on. And then Christmas also was able to absorb the nearby Roman holiday of Saturnalia and adopted many of its rituals too. And so as an example here, we have a mosaic at the Vatican where Christ is wearing a radiate crown and driving a chariot, thus adopting the old mythological motif of the sun crossing the sky in a chariot. Identifying Jesus with the sun and portraying him in solar imagery was helpful to the Christian cause. For example, in a Christmas sermon, Saint Ambrose embraced this motif. He said, quote, well do Christian people call this holy day on which our Lord was born the day of the new sun. We are happy to accept and maintain this view because the day spring of the Savior not only is the salvation of mankind renewed, but also the splendor of the sun. For if the sun withdrew its light when Christ suffered, it must shine at his birth with greater splendor than ever before, unquote. A few words about myth making and Santa Claus. This saint lived in the late 3rd century. He was Bishop of Myrna on the coast of Asia Minor. He was almost martyred in Diocletian's persecutions, but got out of it. He was venerated in his hometown, and that was a seaport, so he became a patron saint of sailors and also of ships and their cargoes. And this made him interesting to the Venetians, which was a maritime empire. So the Venetians from Bari captured his remains and brought him there and eventually took him to Venice's Church of St. Nicholas. His feast day is December 6th, the traditional day of his death. And myths and legends developed in Europe about him once his remains were transferred there. And as a bishop, he wore a red mitre and robe, which led to Santa Claus's red clothes. The main legend or myth about him was that there was a poor man who had 3 daughters, and they were old enough to think about getting married, but they couldn't because they were so poor. They didn't have a dowry. So when Nicholas found out about this, in the middle of the night, he came over and threw bags of gold into their house so that they would have enough money to get married. He was also said to restore the lives of children killed by an evil butcher. So he became a patron saint of children. And that also kind of gets into the rebirth and resurrection thing, because the children were revived. And of course, that's associated with Jesus. The American Santa Claus came mainly from the Dutch Sinterklaas, and the name comes from Santa means saint, of course, and Claus is just a shortening of Nicholas. St. Nicholas's Day and its gift giving were not linked with Christmas until the story of the night before Christmas. And the Dutch Sinterklaas used a horse and wagon to deliver gifts. St. Nicholas didn't use reindeer in Moore's, Nicholas first used reindeer in Moore's poem. Before that, we had horses and goats in Nordic countries, and Norse myths may have influenced the introduction of reindeer. Thor's two goats drew his chariot across the sky and delivered Yule gifts to children. And in Finland, the Santa Father Christmas figure is still called Joulupukki, which means Yule goat. Christmas developed through the Dark Ages, Middle Ages, and modern Europe differently in various cultures and nations, and it's impossible to cover everything here, so I'll cover only 5 general trends. First, in late Rome, the Saturnalia festival influenced the early development of Christmas. Held near the winter solstice, it was an end-of-the-year festival of dissolution held in a carnival-like atmosphere of revelry. But among these revels were many rituals that carried over to Christmas. These include gift giving, especially to children, and that tradition comes from Saturnalia. It's not the example of the Magi who gave gifts to the infant Christ. Feasting, taking the day off of work were included, adorning the entrances of temples with green foliage, symbolizing the continuation of life and fertility, which is an antecedent to our Christmas wreaths, trees, mistletoe, holly, and so forth. And the burning of wax candles, symbolizing the returning power of the sun's light, about to happen on the solstice in a few days. Second aspect is the European winter solstice festivals that influenced Christmas had some of the same features, such as greenery, bonfires, the Yule log, because the solstice is a liminal time when the veils between the earthly and supernatural worlds are thin. Christmas Eve was also considered a good time for divination rituals. Some thought that animals gained the power of speech on Christmas Eve and that uncanny beings roamed over the land, so it was best to stay inside. In parallel, Christian miracles were thought to occur too. For example, that water turned into wine at midnight on Christmas Eve. Some bizarre holdovers from superstitious pagan rituals and beliefs continued, but now as part of Christmas. For example, in parts of Germany, on Christmas morning before the cattle were watered, a dog was thrown into the water to protect the cattle from the mange. In Bohemia, a black cat was caught, boiled and buried by night under a tree to keep evil spirits away from the fields. In France and the British Isles, people hunted and killed a wren because it was considered a magical bird that brings good fortune, and they paraded it around town from house to house to confer good luck. You know, these days we bemoan the commercialization of Christmas, but this is rather contained compared to what happened long ago. The third aspect is the kind of winter solstice revelry that carried over from Saturnalia was also present in Europe and became part of Christmas. In practice, it was a winter solstice party with a Christian veneer on top. In medieval times, the festivities also took on the characteristics of a festival of dissolution, with a lord of misrule or similar figure presiding over the revels. Even within churches, the Christmas season also included the Feast of Fools, and in France, Switzerland, and other areas, the temporary appointment of a choir boy as a boy bishop to take on adult roles in the church temporarily. This riotous tradition appeared in America in non-Puritan circles. One minister complained in 1758 that Christmas had become a time for, quote, sinning, sexuality, luxury, and various forms of extravagance, as though men were not celebrating the birth of the Holy Jesus, but of Venus or Bacchus, unquote. Fourth, attempts were made to ban Christmas, both because of the above-mentioned excesses and among Puritans because it was considered a popish invention with no scriptural basis. Since Puritan culture dominated early colonial American culture, it took a while for Christmas to take hold in the United States. Fifth, all attempts to ban Christmas failed. Christmas not only survived, but it flourished in both its Christian and pagan aspects, which have in common their symbolism of eternal life and light. These developments, together with our earlier discussion of how the Christmas story fits into common mythological motifs, suggest that the narrative and mythical and ritual aspects of this are important, let me try that one again. These developments, together with our earlier discussion over how the Christmas story fits into common mythological motifs, suggest that the narrative and ritual elements of this important enduring holiday are archetypal, recognizing their basis in the human psyche, from which much of its underlying meaning derives. So we'll finish by considering that interpretation. So what I'm going to go through in these final 8 minutes or so is not something I've made up, but it's a mainstream idea having been mapped out by Carl Jung and other depth psychologists and mythologists. I've refined it a bit in relation to Christmas. We need to start with some basics of depth psychology because they drive the Christmas story as myth. Depth psychology is the area of psychology that studies the unconscious and its relationship to ego consciousness, which I'll abbreviate as EC, together with what is really the total psyche, also called the self. Unconscious content of the psyche is part personal based on our individual experience and part collective because of we all share the same biologically evolved structures in our brains. The structures in the collective unconscious, called archetypes, help us to navigate common patterns of life with less conscious effort. So archetypes include the father archetype, mother, child archetypes, the self, and various others. And this means that ego consciousness is mostly ignorant of the totality of ourself. So what has to happen is that archetypal content from the collective unconscious must make itself felt to some extent. Otherwise, there is a psychic imbalance and the spiritual life of people suffers. But EC can become too dominant, blocking archetypal content from emerging, and also repressing or suppressing unpleasant personal experiences into the personal unconscious. EC is our cognitive mind at work. In particular, it distinguishes opposites such as male, female, good, evil, and so forth. In contrast, within the collective unconscious lies a unity prior to the emergence of opposites. This is what is felt by mystics in all religions and secular spiritual practices. This is numinous, and we experience it as divine, quote unquote. Different religions and secular practices then interpret that experience differently. The psychological approach does not logically exclude a supernatural source behind the experience, but it does not find as necessary as an explanation. So we can all interpret this experience in our own way. The experience of the divine or the holy occurs when archetypal content carried by psychic energy or libido rises up and is felt by ego consciousness, which naturally experiences it as something from outside because it is outside of ego consciousness normal awareness. The goal in depth psychology is to achieve and maintain psychic balance by fostering a dialogue between EC and the unconscious. This process is called integration or individuation. It results in the wholeness of our psyche and our living a more spiritual life connected with the sacred. Both myths and celebrating holidays can help us achieve this because they take us out of our ordinary mundane lives dominated by EC and foster a sacred experience of divinity. Christmas is, together with Easter, is the best example and opportunity for this in our Western culture. In the Bible, the Holy Spirit is a creative, animating, divine force, energy that mediates between the divine and the human or earthly. That's how Jesus was conceived. It also enables people to do extraordinary things, such as speaking in tongues and proclaim the gospel and perform miracles, which we see in the New Testament. Psychologically, it is psychic energy from the unconscious, which carries substantive, often archetypal content from the unconscious to EC. It is felt physically and emotionally. It's palpable, and it is indeed holy in the sense that I've been discussing here. The moment when this divine energy and content hit EC can be thought of as an incarnation. Previously, it did not exist for EC, but now it will be embodied as soul, integrated into our self. It is a spiritual birth, or rather rebirth. We're born again. But what exactly is incarnated and born within us? Well, it's the Christmas story. It's the divine child, which is an aspect of the child archetype. Conceived by Holy Spirit is the divine child. He has a spiritual birth. And so psychologically speaking, he incorporates the unconscious. As a young child, the ego is not so separated from the unconscious. In a young child, the divine child represents a bridge between the unconscious and EC, which leads to integration of the psyche. The divine child wants the attention of EC, which must recognize and accept him. This is the mythopsychological meaning of the adoration of the Magi and of the shepherds. Recognition. But EC may reject the child, as symbolized in the story of the massacre of the innocents. Herod and the Romans generally are EC run rampant. Thus, Jesus says, quote, "Unless you change and become as little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." Mark's gospel provides a larger narrative context for this metaphor of integration. The enacted, quote, parable of the child amongst in Mark 9, verses 33 through 37 can be read according to the psychological framework. In verse 34, the disciples' egos are driving their behavior, so they are competing with each other for greatness and preeminence, which hinders their spiritual growth. In response, Jesus teaches them that if anyone would be first, initially he must be last, as a humble servant. I should mention that in the ancient households where this scene takes place, the children have the lowest status. So as Jesus embraces a child and takes it onto his lap, he teaches that a person first must identify oneself with a child, and in an important sense become mentally like one, with the ego having no pretensions to greatness. This opens the door to the incarnation of the divine within us as individuals. Psychologically, the story shows the need to tame ego consciousness by becoming like a child so that self-aware individuation can occur. This can establish a new pattern for human relationships that will leave no occasion for strife, as was occurring amongst the disciples at the beginning of the story. The goal of the individuation process in New Testament terms is the kingdom of God. Psychologically speaking, this is the point where the self has become integrated. This is why, for example, Jesus in Mark 12, verse 25 can say that there's no marriage in the kingdom of God. Instead, people will exist like angels in heaven. The opposites, in this case, the masculine and feminine principles, will have been resolved and integrated. The idea is similar in religions worldwide. In Hinduism, for example, the divine child Ganesha, pictured here in something of a combination of a nativity scene and a Madonna and child, is born from the spirit of his father Shiva and Parvati. He's a unity not only of male and female, but God and goddess, eternal and temporal, and so forth. As such, he represents the integration of opposites in the psyche and the path toward spiritual enlightenment. Jung said that Christ is a symbol of the self, and this he meant it in two senses. One is in terms of process, and the other in terms of substance. First, as to process, as God-man, Jesus symbolized the dynamic process occurring between the unconscious and EC. As the Son of God, he's a mediator between the unconscious and the EC. Through him, we can receive the Holy Spirit, psychic energy, that carries unconscious content to EC. He, as a symbol, unblocks it. His incarnation symbolizes unconscious content impacting on EC as the divine child. And then in terms of substance, he symbolizes the result of the above process, which is the integrated self. In relation to Christmas, in particular, it is the integration symbolized by the divine child. And this is reflected in Jesus's own teaching. The archetypal nature of Christ is evidenced by Christianity's spread and acceptance in the many cultures of the Mediterranean, As Jung put it, quote, Christ never would have made the impression he did on his followers if he had not expressed something that was alive and at work in their unconscious. Christianity itself would never have spread through the pagan world with such astonishing rapidity had its ideas not found an analogous psychic readiness to receive them, unquote. As a result, Christians were able to live more spiritually integrated lives. So it turns out that Jesus was a very good depth psychologist, way ahead of his time. He was known for exercising people's inner demons, after all. This is the last slide. In summary, the miraculous conception and birth of the divine child represent the incarnation of the divine within ourselves and potential for a better future. Recognizing and accepting him as the Magi did results in integration. His birth is a spiritual birth, and so can ours be too, our second birth. Christians concretize this in terms of the future realization of the kingdom of God, or salvation by going to heaven in the afterlife. Psychologically, however, this is an internal affair, here and now. Jesus himself spoke in such terms, telling the Pharisees that, quote, the kingdom of God is within you. Similarly, according to the Gospel of Thomas, he taught quote, when you give rise to that which is in you, what you have will save you. If you do not give rise to it, what you do not have will destroy you. And also, the kingdom is within you. When you know yourselves, you will know that you are sons of the living Father. That is, incarnation will have occurred. Observing Christmas offers us the chance to achieve our own incarnation by giving birth and celebrating the divine child within us. We each can have our own individual way of putting Christ back into Christmas. Thank you. That's all.
All right. All right, very nice. This information that Arthur has here will be on the YouTube channel. And in our email that came out for tonight, I know there's a link so you can buy the book. And if you need any more information, you can just go ahead and email. So Arthur, if you'll close, unshare or stop sharing. All right, great. We can open this up. If there are any questions, you can just unmute yourself and ask away. I'll start. Arthur, I know you and Elena spent many years in Russia celebrating Christmas, I'm assuming. Is there a big difference that you see in the two celebrations here versus there?
I think the liturgy in the Russian Orthodox and Greek Orthodox is, it's a longer liturgy, and I think a lot of people will say more spiritual in the case of the actual ritual. And so that still has an influence. When there was the Soviet Union, we didn't have commerce as we know it. So Christmas never got commercialized. So how Christmas is celebrated has been preserved, I think, more intact to the original story compared to how it evolved over here. Of course, since the breakup of the Soviet Union, they're starting to catch up in the worst aspects of the holiday. The other thing to say about it is that even before the Soviet Union, but even more so during the Soviet Union, which is an atheistic state, New Year's was substituted for Christmas, more or less. So all this stuff about from Christmas got transferred over to New Year's Day for a while. So like you had the fir tree, the evergreen tree, you would decorate it. There was a gift-giving figure, but he's called Father Frost, not Santa Claus, and so forth. So people celebrated New Year's, and And now that you can celebrate Christmas in Russia again, people have fun doing both New Year's and Christmas. And the other thing is that because of the old Russian calendar, which is 13 days behind ours, a lot of people in Russia will celebrate both the Western Christmas and New Year's, and then again they will celebrate the old calendar Christmas and New Year's. So they get to celebrate 4 holidays over this period instead of just 1 or 2.
All right, thanks. Jerry, are you raising your hand?
Yeah, by lowering my mic.
Oh, very good. Very good.
I got this special mic that when it mutes, moving it.
Ah,
That was a gift from my son-in-law, who's in the telecommunication business. First of all, Arthur, thank you very much for such a comprehensive and thoughtful presentation. I mean, it's really an amazing amount of information and ideas you've shared in 1 hour. It's incredible.
Yeah, it's just a few highlights. The Christmas and Easter chapters of the book are the 2 longest ones, and there's a lot more there, which I couldn't get to tonight.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
Do you see a correlation of any kind with this conjunction we're about to have now between Saturn and Jupiter and the idea of the Christmas star?
Yeah, there's well, as I mentioned in the presentation, I mean, the star or comet or whatever, is a sort of a standard mythological motif. But when people started to try and look at the story from a more scientific perspective, I guess, rationalistic perspective is probably better, they tried to explain it in terms of astronomy. And one of the potential explanations was a conjunction of the planets. And, inevitably there were a few conjunctions within the several years of time span where the birth of Jesus might have occurred. So, I mean, people can point to this or that conjunction or this or that comet and so forth, or supernova. That was another explanation. But I mean, nobody's really, I can't say there's one dominant explanation. Nobody's really been able to prove it to everybody's satisfaction. So I mean, there may have been something. It's kind of like the census. There was a census of Quirinus many years after the census that was talked about in Luke, in the story. So they may be latching on to some other event and then bringing it into the time of the story.
Elena?
The curious thing about the December 25 story is that Mithras in Zoroastrianism, Dionysus in ancient Rome, even the sun god Mitra in Hinduism were all said to be born on December 25.
Mm-hmm.
So it's,
yeah, the solstice attracts a lot of things.
Yeah, more like symbolical of something. And
Yeah, well, it's the most people when they're growing up, they think, oh man, it's the darkest day of the year. Why celebrate it? Blah, blah, blah. And then of course, when you look into the mythology, you find that it's not about it being the darkest day of the year. It's the time when things start to turn back to light. So it's the reemergence of the light, because we've now had the darkest day and it's the time for the turnover. So it symbolizes light, hope, and all that kind of stuff. And so you get that everywhere.
Art, do you know what's the speculation about the real date in which Jesus was born? I mean, among scholars.
Yeah, nobody really knows. There've been some people think that because of the shepherd story in Luke, that it was the time of the year when they were tending their flocks. So it'd be like, I guess, still in the fall. I forget what time of year they said that mean. I don't know. In that part of the world whether you have to bring your flocks in for the winter, like you do up in Northern Europe. So I forget what they concluded, but they based it on the shepherds being out in the fields as opposed to being at home.
I see.
It looks like Robert left us. Jim, do you have any insight any insight of the date?
So you are asking them because they are,
Jim Burrow?
yeah,
Oh,
because they're
he's a
priests
priest.
in the liberal Catholic Church. You have to unmute them, I guess.
I don't know if he heard me. They have to do it. So that's okay.
I heard you.
Unmute. There we go.
Okay,
There you go.
just as that early on, there were many dates that were chosen as Christ's birth date. It was only a decree from the church councils that finally settled it on a particular date, because there were so many different dates. But I really liked what you were talking about the EC and the unconscious being brought together in these rituals. I think that's very important, because we have all of that within us. All those events and their meaning and their power are already there. We just have to find the ways to get them out. To unlock them.
That's
And,
my feeling too. Yeah, that's why I wanted to talk about it. And it's also what's inside us also in turn helps generate the stories that we get in the myths, so it kind of is a full circle. And then I go through this depth psychology aspect in terms of Easter too, in the Easter chapter of the book about resurrection and all that stuff. So you would like that too, I suppose. If we do a program on that, we could talk about it.
Yeah. It's interesting how we give power to others to unlock these secrets for us. I'm thinking particularly of my own ordination ceremony, where a bishop ordains me. It was a very important ceremony for me, and what did he do that unlocked that that sensation, that realization that came through that? It's just kind of interesting, and I'm reminded also of something that I.K. Timely wrote. I don't know if Timely is an important author in theosophical circles. He wrote that there are two stages of consciousness that we cannot access on our own, that we must be initiated into them. I thought that was a very profound statement, and showed me that I can do a lot of work, but there's still things that I can't do that others have to do for me. That's it.
Yeah, it's funny how a lot of the spiritual stuff ends up being externalized and projected rather than focusing inward. But that's what we have to deal with. Before I forget, any other questions? I picked this background. This is not my office, by the way. It's virtual. These are the Magi, of course, following the star. And I picked this one because you see the star, it's hovering over the house where Jesus is born. And actually, it looks more like the manger in Luke. It's actually out of town. If you can see, the town of Bethlehem is behind. And I chose this because Matthew says that the star actually, the Magi came to Jerusalem first and talked to Herod, and then they went down to Bethlehem because the star was leading them there. And so the star took a left turn and went down to Bethlehem and was actually hovering over the house where Jesus was born that night. Although here it seems to be hovering over the outbuilding with a manger rather than their house. So it's another example of how these things get confused.
All right, well, thank you. Oh, go ahead, Maria.
Just a brief comment. I have a beautiful nativity scene that's all hand carved that my husband and I bought on our honeymoon in Switzerland. And every time I set it up before Christmas, well before Christmas, it becomes a focal point for me. And it really does bring together so many of those universal symbols of the soul, its awakening, its new birth, its renewal. And it's almost like a kind of mandala that draws the attention, quiets us down, at least for me. It is, I bow to that scene every day, and it is has been very important for me. And it carries its own power, and no matter how we wish to explore it, it continues to speak to us when we're open. I appreciate very much the details you've shared. It is a whole lot, and I hope you will do the Easter for us, perhaps for the school. That would be maybe more than one session and would give us a time to savor the experience a bit more.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I look forward to doing it at some point. Yeah, I had our family when I was growing up had an old hand carved, I think it was from Italy, nativity scene. And one of my favorite things was to set that up every year, and I would look at it a lot. And I think you're right. If you understand what all that goes into that story from all the perspectives, it really can be a focus for meditation and thought. So yeah, that's a good point that you raised.
Okay, so thank you. I'm going to hit stop recording.